Hi there. Welcome to a very special presentation on WayCam. This is Early American Roads and Trails with a focus on early American roads and trails of Massachusetts. And it's brought to you by our friends at the WAYLAND Council on Aging. Now, the views and opinions expressed on WayCam television are those of the author, John Horrigan, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the WAYLAND Council on Aging or WAYLAND Community Access and Media. Any content that I provide is of my own personal opinion and is not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. Now, when I use the term Indian, I do not mean to use it in a derogatory sense. Native Americans, indigenous peoples, First Nation tribes, etc., are all interchangeable appellations. And it's a text-driven lecture for the benefit of folks like me who may have difficulty hearing, or any audio or technical issues that you encounter in the production of this presentation are due to my lack of technical acumen. I'm all thumbs. So maybe one day I'll have the opportunity to make a live presentation before you at the WAYLAND Council on Aging. But until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay strong. And I'd love to hear from you. There's always somebody who knows more about the following subject than I do. And you can contact me at johnhorrigan@hotmail.com online, or follow me on Facebook at J.R. Horrigan, John Horrigan, historian, pro sports announcer. So this is Early Roads and Trails of Massachusetts. And I used to host a show called The Folklorist out of New TV in Newton, Massachusetts. You can reach it by logging on to www.folklorist.tv or going to YouTube and searching for The Folklorist. And I was very lucky enough to win 5 Boston, New England Emmy Awards as the host, co-writer, and co-producer. And I was blessed to receive 20 Boston, New England Emmy Award nominations in the 5 years the show ran. I also won 13 Telly Awards, 7 Communicator Awards, and in 2015 and 2016, New TV out of Newton, Mass. went first place back-to-back in arts and entertainment, according to the Alliance of Community Media. But unfortunately, like any show, it's tough to get off the ground. It was the critically acclaimed show that nobody was watching. It ended in September of 2016, but it was a great experience, great run. So we're in the footsteps of our ancestors, and today's roads are the roads of yesterday. We travel by automobile on ancient footpaths that have been used for over a millennium. So today's talk will be light on technical and engineering aspects in regard to surveying, grading, leveling, blasting, clearing quarries, etc. But let's never forget how efficient and smooth our roads are of today, except in March when winter turns into spring and the potholes pop. Nothing you can do about it. The next time somebody asks you for directions, maybe you can pretend as if you were back from the 17th century. Travel about 3 miles in the Bay Path, and then take the left fork to the old Connecticut Path, and then continue on to the lower Boston Post Road. They'll probably give you a look. But the old Connecticut Path, which we'll chat about in just a little while, runs through WAYLAND, for WAYLAND is in the path of history. Old Connecticut Path is actually modern-day Route 126 that deviates off of Route 20. And of course, the Henry Knox Trail, which we may chat about in the future, also runs through WAYLAND on modern-day Route 20. Henry Knox, in November of 1775, began to take cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and move them down the banks of the Hudson River and across the Hudson, across the Mohawk River, across the Berkshires, the Connecticut River, and all the way into Boston. And in fact, when the guns were emplaced on Dorchester Heights, it was one of the contributing factors that made the British evacuate Boston, which we still celebrate today, March 17th, 1776, Evacuation Day in Boston. And you've probably seen these markers along the trail. There's one in WAYLAND, and it reads, through this place passed General Henry Knox in the winter of 1775, 1776, to deliver to General George Washington at Cambridge the train of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga used to force the British Army to evacuate Boston. So maybe one time I'll make a presentation on that. So we're going to talk about primitive roads and routes, early American explorer trails, the Nemasket Path, the Old Coast Path, the Watertown Path, the Bay Path, the Old Connecticut Path, which is part of the Great Trail, and the Bay Road, which is also known as the Old Roebuck Road. And then we'll look at the Boston Post Road, there's 3 of them, and how they connect into the King's Highway, a long thoroughfare that runs essentially the length of the eastern seaboard. And then we'll conclude with a talk on the Mohawk Trail, and also known as the Iroquois Trail. So if we look at trails and footpaths, they've been developed over tens of thousands of years as pedestrian passageways between settlements and villages for hunting game, and eventually as thoroughfares for trade. Some were just simply modified animal paths, and they tended to track alongside rivers, lakes, bays, and coastal areas. They traversed flat land areas, and they traveled through settlements. Now, by about 10,000 BC, rough roads and pathways were used by human travelers. When I mean BC, before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era. Now, roads were essentially widened mass paths. They were required to accommodate increasing pedestrian traffic along original routes as settlers walked to market centers or to their local place of government or their local place of worship. Now, after the adaptation of beasts of burden as a faster and a more efficient mode of transportation, of course, they could trail along carts and wagons and tow them behind them. These trails were then extended, widened, and their surfaces became more compressed. And eventually, lanes were required to ensure the traffic proceeded orderly and more readily in each direction. Now, log roads date back to 4000 BC, and they were found in Glastonbury, England. It's known as the Sweet Track, and it's a timber track causeway in England, and it's one of the oldest engineered roads ever discovered in Northern Europe. And we think it was built almost to the day 3807 BC because they dated the tree rings in the logs. Now, in 2009, a 6,000-year-old trackway was discovered in Plumstead, London. And stone-paved streets were found in the city of Ur in the Sumerian region, southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the Middle East dating back to 4000 BC. Now, brick-paved streets were used in India as early as 3000 BC. And the world's oldest known paved road was laid in Egypt at Weden al-Faras, sometime between 2600 and 2200 BC. Now, the Persian Royal Road. It's a 1,700-mile road from Susa to Sardis, and it goes near the sacred city of Nineveh. And there were stations with fresh horses every 15 miles. And it took 7 days to travel with a letter from Susa to Sardis. And in 500 BC, Darius I created an extensive road system for Persia, modern-day Iran, including the Royal Road, which was one of the finest highways of its time and was still in use after Roman times. Of course, from about 312 BC, the Roman Empire built straight, strong stone roads throughout Europe and North Africa to support their military campaigns. At its peak, the Roman Empire was connected by 29 major roads moving out from Rome and covering 53,000 miles of paved roads. And on the map here, you can see Rome, the nexus, roads heading towards the west in Massilia in Gaul, modern-day France, and Toledo, modern-day Spain, also through Milan, and then to the east to Byzantium, modern-day Turkey, Anatolia, Athens, Greece, around to the Middle East and Damascus, Syria, Jerusalem and Israel, and then Alexandria and Memphis in ancient Egypt, and all the way to Carthage, the ancient city of Carthage in modern-day Tunisia. Now, when the Romans made roads, they essentially furrowed out, dug essentially a ditch or a trench, and they'd fill it with sand. And then on top of that, they put stone slabs in a primitive mortar or cement. On top of that, they'd flatten out crushed stone, again, mixed in a primitive cement or mortar. And then finally, they'd put smooth stone blocks on the surface, crested, so the water would run off into drainage ditches. Now, the Silk Road was derived from the lucrative trade in Chinese silk, spices, and porcelain from the Far East. It connected the West and the East from China to the Mediterranean Sea, beginning around 207 BC. You can see the blue trail there shows you the maritime route. And it's quite difficult if you left from Italy and then stopped in Greece. You'd have to have portage or carry your vessel overland because there was no Suez Canal at that time, and then put it back into the Red Sea and then on to India and China. Whereas the land road, the Silk Road, was in red, and it basically emanated from Constantinople in the Middle East, across Persia and the steppes of Mongolia, Russia, and then into China and India. And it was a significant factor in the development of civilizations in Asia and Africa, and it opened long-distance political and economic relations between ancient civilizations. Now, after Constantinople fell in 1452, the Silk Road became too dangerous for caravans of merchants and pilgrims. If you were lucky enough, if you had to pay a toll, otherwise you'd be robbed and in some cases even murdered. So that's when this explorer, Christopher Columbus, decided to sail west to reach the far east. Now, in the 8th century AD, many roads were built throughout the Arab Empire, and the most sophisticated roads were those in Baghdad, which were paved with tar. Now, tar was derived from petroleum, which was accessed from oil fields in the region through the chemical process of destructive distillation. Even in ancient times, though, transport by river was far easier and faster than transport by road, especially considering the cost of road construction and the difference in carrying capacity between carts pulled by beasts of burden or river barges. Now, we know that the first early North American explorers were the Vikings when they landed in northwest Newfoundland in Lanso Meadows. Archaeological digs reveal that over 1,000 years ago, Vikings settled the area. And there's the Viking Trail, which runs along the far western, northwestern coast of Newfoundland. I've been lucky to travel to St. Anthony 3 times in my life. But modern day Newfoundland Labrador Route 430 is a 260-mile-long paved highway that traces portions of the alleged exploration trail used by the first Norse settlers. I say alleged because we don't really know. There have been archaeological artifacts that have been discovered, but they believe that the Vikings, once they landed at Lanso Meadows, if they traveled south, which they most certainly did, all the way into Deer Lake, they probably went along the coast. Now, in 1528, a Spanish expedition exploring Florida was stranded there, and they built barges and sailed along the southern coast of the United States and landed near Galveston, Texas. Cabeza de Vaca, he was one of the 4 ragged castaways who were among the first non-Indians to set foot on Texas soil. Cabeza de Vaca, or Cabeza de Vaca, means cow's head. But you can see his route here. He came through Santo Domingo, modern-day Dominican Republic, or known as Hispaniola back then by Columbus, then landed in Cuba, went around to the west coast of Florida to Tampa, and their barge traveled just by the Mississippi River Delta. And then they landed on the outer banks of Galveston, Texas. They would actually cross the Rio Grande River 3 times in their expedition before heading south through Mexico City and eventually arriving to the coast of Veracruz. Now, they were shipwrecked and they traveled by foot for 8 years across the Southwest, trading with various Native American tribes before they finally reconnected with Spanish colonial forces in Mexico in the year 1536. Now, I'm not a fan of Spanish conquistadors. They were after one thing, the precious metal that drives men insane, that has caused wars and spilt so much blood over 10,000 years. Gold. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. He was a Spanish conquistador who searched for El Dorado and the 7 cities of gold from 1540 to 1542. And he discovered the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. And when I say discover, he was the first European to document it. And of course, in his search for gold, his lust for gold, he left blood in his wake, and he decimated many Native American settlements in his wake. You can see he landed in Compostela, headed north, across the Rio Grande into eastern Arizona, then across New Mexico, and then through the panhandles of both Texas and Oklahoma, and finally reaching Quivira in Kansas. There was also Hernando de Soto, another Spanish conquistador, and he led the first European expedition deep into the territory of the modern United States. We can see his trail starting in Florida, in the Tampa region, heading north through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, once back through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and then into Arkansas, Louisiana, and finally Texas. And this was in the year 1539. And he was the first European to cross the Mississippi River. Now, some of the swine that were brought by De Soto eventually escaped, and they became the ancestors of the razorback pigs in the southeastern United States. Razorbacks, which is the moniker for the University of Arkansas for their teams, they have these tusks on the bottom. And they're very feral, and they could easily replicate themselves, and they quickly grew, as did horses. The modern horse was reintroduced to North America by Hernando de Cortez, Cortez the Killer, who wiped out the Aztecs in 1519 in Mexico. But some of his horses escaped, went north through Mexico into the continental United States, and eventually into the plains of Canada. So within 150 years of being let go by Cortez, by 1670, there was over 1 million horses roaming the plains. And of course, the Native Americans would adapt the horse, the equine, as a form of transportation. But if you look at the native beasts of burden to Mesoamerica, which is ancient North America, Central America, South America, they only had the llama. And the settlers were the ones that brought over their guns, their germs, their steel, their alcohol, and their broken promises. And some of the germs they brought were all animal born, because the people in Europe had lived domestically with animals for thousands upon thousands of years. So they built up antibodies, immunities. And then when they came to North America, especially Hispaniola, they brought disease because these native indigenous people did not have the antibodies to fight off the infection, whether it be chickenpox, smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, malaria. And eventually, it caused the Great Dying, which allegedly took place from 1616 to 1618, just before the arrival of the Pilgrims in Plymouth. Now, my thoughts, and I'll talk about this in a second, are that it was actually brought by one man on John Hunt's expedition. John Hunt traveled with John Smith to map the coast in 1614. We'll talk about that in just a second. But if you look at the 6 beasts that were brought over by the explorers and the settlers, right, brought horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens. So they were not native to Mesoamerica. And then the first English colony in the New World was established in 1585. It was located in a place they called Virginia, named after their virgin queen, Elizabeth I. And of course, they found footpaths with the Native Americans already there, settled, who had been there for thousands of years. And they found game trails where they'd go to hunt. And John White, who was in charge of the expedition, left the colony in 1587 to go back to England to bring more settlers and more supplies. But due to the battle with the Spanish Armada, he was delayed 3 years. And he finally got back in 1590, only to find the colony missing. And they would dub it the lost colony of Roanoke. And all he found was the word Croatoan inscribed or carved into a tree. It's still a mystery today where they went. In all likelihood, all these settlers that came over didn't have farming experience. They probably were starving, and they went to desperate measures where they'd raid Native American food stores. And of course, they would get into subsequent conflict with the indigenous peoples. So England twice attempted to establish a colony, and twice they failed at Roanoke. And then came Jamestown, April 1607, the Virginia Company of London's plan to colonize for profit. And during the voyage, John Smith was charged with mutiny, but he was spared when orders were unsealed that designated him to be one of the leaders of the new colony. And of course, they had footpaths and trails, and they hunted game, and then they did exploratory probing to chart the maps, and also to find out what hostile tribes were out there of indigenous Americans. And of course, there was starvation and disease in Jamestown, where somebody died almost daily. Now, allegedly, John Smith was captured by the Algonquin chief Powhatan. And he says, and sorry about the Cockney accent, but at the minute of my execution, she hazarded the beating out of her own brains to save mine. And not only that, but so prevailed with her father that I was safely conducted to Jamestown. What John Smith is saying here is that at the last second, Pocahontas begged her father to spare his life. So he would follow the trails back to Jamestown because he was blindfolded. And he was known as a great explorer. There's no doubting that. But John Smith was also a great exaggerator, walking across Russia. He claimed to have fought 3 men and cut all 3 of their heads off in one fight. I don't know. But what we do know is we wouldn't be here today, or the Pilgrims wouldn't have landed here, if it weren't for John Smith, who returned in 1614 to explore and map the area north of Jamestown, which he would call New England. Now, south of New England is a place called New Amsterdam, which at that point was occupied by the Dutch. But he designated the river known as the Massachusetts River to the Massachusetts tribes. He called it River Charles after King Charles. And then the north coast he called Cape Anna. Today we call it Cape Ann in northeastern Massachusetts after the princess. And he most likely disembarked in Boston Harbor, maybe even Watertown, gone down the Charles River. And we know that on his way up the coast that he got into a fracas, a confrontation with the Quonehasset or the Conohasset tribe of Native Americans. Today we know that area as Cohasset, where the glades are. The glades are a series of rocks that emerge at certain tides, and they've taken many, many ships to the bottom with them starting from the 1600s all the way up to the 20th century. And this is where Smith got into a conflict with them. In fact, he did what any explorer would do. He'd shoot before thinking with his muskets, and he killed one Quonehasset Native American and wounded another in the leg. So right off the bat, there was conflict. There was conflict in Roanoke Colony. There was conflict in Jamestown, and there was conflict in 1614 when Smith came to map the area. And as I mentioned, John Smith was joined on that expedition. There were two ships. The other was captained by John Hunt, and he was a bad man. And it's, in my opinion, the Great Dying, when the Native Americans died off on the East Coast, essentially giving the land up for free because there was nobody to guard it or maintain it. And that's when the Pilgrims came. They thought that seeing all these bleached bones of deceased Native Americans that had perished due to the Great Dying, due to the pox, they thought it was providence by God. But the area where John Hunt landed was known as Patuxet, which the Pilgrims would come back 6 years later in 1620 and call it Plymouth after their hometown. But I believe due to the decimation of that Patuxet village, there are numbers that say anywhere from 75 to even 95% of all Native American tribes along the East Coast were decimated by disease. And common historical lore says that the disease was brought by French trappers in northern Maine and then made its way down the coast. I tend to think there are two epicenters, and one was earlier in Patuxet. And again, I'm debating with virologists and epidemiologists about this, but I think that the first wave of the Great Dying was brought by John Hunt. And of course, Hunt got into conflict with the local Native American tribes of the Wampanoag Federation, even cut off one of the Wampanoag's heads, accusing them of stealing a silver item from his ship. And then John Smith headed back to England before Hunt with his ship loaded with cod and located with the new gold, which was beaver pelts, all the rage in Europe. In his, they say he had over 10,000 beaver pelts in his hold when he headed back to England. He encountered bad weather and he encountered pirates as well. But so get to 1620, and the Pilgrims who left England in early September 1620 sighted land in the New World on November 9th, 1620, and then they anchored the Mayflower in Provincetown Harbor on November 11th, 1620. Originally, they were headed to Jamestown, then New Amsterdam, but the winds blew them north, and the captain decided that he couldn't turn back. He went around the hook of the Cape and then threw anchor in Provincetown Harbor, and the rest was history. That same day, not only would they draft the Mayflower Compact, which was an early constitution in America, but they also sent an exploration party of 16 men in a shallop, a small boat that they brought on the Mayflower, to look for fresh water. The reason why the Pilgrims had to throw anchor is they ran out of beer. Back in those days, you didn't want to drink fresh water, because it would be tainted with diseases like cholera. And the 66-day journey, which took place, their water was tainted. And that's why they came ashore looking for fresh water. They were also looking for a new home, and they spent 5 weeks exploring Cape Cod before they even sailed to Plymouth, Massachusetts. In fact, on their route to Plymouth, they were shipwrecked momentarily, or for a couple of days, on Clark's Island in Plymouth Harbor. So after they spent weeks at sea, the Pilgrims resolved not to set foot on land until the Mayflower Compact was written, signed, and adopted by the colonists. And you can see their first landing, November 11, 1620, looking for fresh water on the hook of Provincetown there. And then they went and they found seed corn on an area called Corn Hill on the Upper Cape. They left a note saying that they replace and replenish the corn to the local natives, the Nemasket Indians. So I often refer to that as the first act of American credit, and they did pay them back. And then, of course, First Encounter Beach, where they first encountered the Nemasket Indians, and that's where 6 Indians or Native Americans, accompanied by a dog, looked about 300 yards down the beach, and they saw these 16 men pulling their shallop ashore, and the world changed for them, for the worse, unfortunately. I'm going to read to you from Pathways of the Past. It's a 3-part series by Maurice Robbins. You can find it at Bridgewater State University, copyright 1984. And he says, both the Indians and the English selected sites for villages with the same characteristics in mind: good drinking water, cleared land for planting, etc. Consequently, many English settlements occupied the sites of former Indian towns, and thus the original trails were continued in use. At first, the English traveled on foot, as had the Indians, but as horses became readily available, trails became bridle paths, and they were widened. Eventually, wheeled vehicles were introduced for inter-village travel, and as the traffic increased, the old footpaths were again widened to permit their use. And 2-wheeled vehicles came first, but were quickly replaced by 4-wheeled carts that could carry greater loads. Now the trails became roads. They were straightened at some spots, widened to allow for passing, and abrupt turns that were difficult for 4-wheeled wagons to negotiate, they just eliminated. Any bad turns, they cut them out. And of course, there was the right-of-way. You had to travel on the right-hand side. And as the unoccupied areas between towns were laid out and occupied as farms, houses and buildings would appear by the roads, just like old Route 66, and resistance to any change in location of the right-of-way stiffened. So this situation tended to maintain the status quo of the early networks of roads in New England. After all, what farmer, though, would welcome a new piece of road that cut through his cultivated fields? He wouldn't want that, something that cut through his pasture. You know, he was willing to have his land cut in two simply to straighten a road. So another development which also tended to perpetuate the road system was the growing use of paths that delineated boundary lines, county lines, town lines, settlement lines, property lines. Now, in those days, it was costly and difficult to run long lines through the virgin forest, so it was much easier to make use of an established path. So essentially, some of the paths that we use today are ancient paths, 500 years old, maybe longer, 700, 800. So, for example, the Five Men's Purchase in modern-day Middleborough, Massachusetts, was bounded on the north by the Lower Plymouth Path and on the south by the Upper Plymouth Path. And such instances made possible the definite mapping of a portion of an old path. So once they did that, they began to map them, saying so others that followed in their footsteps literally could learn their direction on how to travel. So colonists would forge paths while on expeditions that were led by Miles Standish, another one who liked preemptive action, also John Carver and Edward Winslow. And again, they would follow Native American game trails, and they found or made paths both inland and on the coast on Cape Cod, especially when they recovered John Billington. John Billington was a boy who got lost and was, quotation fingers, kidnapped and was subsequently returned by the Nemasket tribe. The Billingtons were your archetypal neighbors who you didn't want to live next to. John Billington Sr. was the first pilgrim who was executed for his crimes, for murder. Let's start off now then with the first Nemasket Path. So the pilgrims are in Patuxet, Plymouth, and the Nemasket Path was probably the first Indian path known and used by the pilgrims. So this well-trodden path led inland from their seaside settlement of Plymouth to an area abounding in freshwater streams and ponds, and it was known to the Indians as Nemasket or Nemasket, which meant the place of fish because it was the largest alewife run on the eastern seaboard. So you can see it, that red line there traveling from Plymouth down to the southwest towards the Bristol, Rhode Island area. And that's where there was a seat of the Wampanoag Federation of Eastern Massachusetts tribes and Eastern Rhode Island tribes under the great sachem or leader, Massasoit. So they weren't too familiar with the native Algonquian tongue at that early date. So the English understood the name to be that of a particular Indian town located somewhere in the vicinity of a wading place or a ford, a low, shallow area where they could cross the Nemasket River. And Nemasket today is near modern-day Middleborough and Taunton. And there was a strike by Miles Standish called the Nemasket raid, preemptive strike against Corbitant, who was one of the sachems of the Wampanoag Federation. And they thought that he had somehow captured Squanto. And of course, Miles Standish went in there and killed some tribesmen. Again, here's these are early contact periods between the Native Americans, this map on the right, and the settlers. And you can see basically the direction that the Nemasket Path would take. And at the shallow place on the Nemasket River, the Nemasket Path would connect with several trails that led north, west, and south to various Pocahontas towns. And you can see this map here. It broke off into two distinct trails, the Plymouth Path on the right, the Nemasket Path on the left, but the Plymouth Path broke into the lower Plymouth Path, which is above, and it broke off into the upper Plymouth Path, which is below on this map. Again, it went into the area of Nemasket, modern-day Middleborough, Taunton. So it was probably the route that was taken by Samoset, who made first contact with the settlers when he walked into the fledgling Plymouth settlement on Friday, March 17, 1621. He was an Abenaki sachem from the Maine coast when he bodily came into the Plymouth settlement, and he greeted the startled men in English. Apparently he said, "Welcome, Englishmen. My name is Samoset." And he had learned the English language after he was captured by English explorers in Maine. And then he asked if they had any beer. So there's a lot of beer in the Pilgrim story. He explained that he was acting on behalf of the Pocahontas, who were their neighbors to the west. Of course, he wanted to find out what was going on in this village on behalf of Massasoit. And again, the Nemasket Path was the path frequently taken by the men of the Pocahontas from the seat of the Wampanoag Federation under the leadership of Massasoit in modern-day Bristol, Rhode Island, in that region, right here. Okay, let's go back there. So you can just show that was Wampanoag territory, whereas Massachusetts Indians were, the tribe was in along the Charles River, Nipmuc, basically out towards central Mass, etc. So in Wayland, the Massachusetts, that was originally Massachusetts Indian land. So you can travel along the modern-day Nemasket Path on certain sections of modern-day Route 44, and even a little Route 24. So now the Puritans arrived 10 years later, 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is established when colonists from England find Boston. And it quickly became the political, commercial, financial, religious, and educational center of the New England region. And it was the first white settler there was a man by the name of William Blackstone, and he arrived on the Shawmut Peninsula in the 1620s. Now, Blackstone was an English clergyman. He was left alone in his home atop what was later Boston's Beacon Hill. After his party returned to England, he decided to stay, and he became friendly with the local native tribes, and he traded with them. And then the Massachusetts Bay Colony's first governor, John Winthrop, led the signing of the Cambridge Agreement, and they called Boston a city upon a hill. It was also known as Tremont, or Trimontaine, or Tri-Mountain. It's a reference to a hill that formerly had three peaks: Beacon Hill, Cotton or Pemberton Hill, and then finally Mount Hordem or Mount Vernon. Now, Cotton Hill today is now Pemberton Square, and Mount Hordem is now modern-day Lewisburg Square. And of course, you've heard Tremont Street. So the hills were leveled and they were used as landfill for Back Bay, along with debris from the Great Fire of November of 1872. That was a fire that decimated Boston. Now, the Shawmut Peninsula was known to be inhabited back to the year 5000 BC, and that's the peninsula. Boston doesn't look like that today. And it was founded in 1630 by Protestant Puritans who came from Charlestown in search of fresh water. And it was named after their former home in Lincolnshire. And then roads quickly developed from pathways in their village as they ventured across the causeway known as Boston Neck. So that's one thing we know for sure is the causeway across the old Boston Neck was one of the first roads out of Boston. And you can see some of the settlements here. You had Plymouth 1620, Boston 1630, Dedham 1636, Scituate 1636, Duxbury 1637, Sandwich 1639, and so on. Rhode Island was settled in 1644. But gradually, these trails became heavily traversed thoroughfares between colonies and villages. Now, I'm going to refer to this map quite extensively. And the first one I want to look at is something known as the Old Coast Path, or they call it the Old Coast Road, or they simply call it the Coast Path. And it follows modern-day Route 3, but mostly modern-day 3A along the south shore of Massachusetts. It was the first route used between Boston and Plymouth, and it was designated as a public highway in 1639. So that's how it went from Plymouth to Boston, traded with them. It was about 45 miles long and was made a toll road in the year 1803. And you can see the direction it took from Plymouth to Boston, shortest route along the coast. Now, the initial westward movement away from the Atlantic coast began in the late 17th century, and by the mid-18th century, the frontier had been removed at places up to 200 miles inland. Now, like the westward expansion that would take place in the 19th century, settlers were driven by the pursuit of inexpensive land suitable for farming. Now, although conflicts with Native American inhabitants sporadically interrupted early migrations, by the first decades of the 17th century, many colonists had used these conveyances to successfully establish settlements well into the interior. And westward migration from the New England colonies occurred in a similar fashion, although there were other factors besides securing land for crops. And environmental conditions were also an important consideration and factor. The rocky soil of New England, especially along the coast, was poorly suited for farming. Acidic, rocky, sandy, just couldn't grow much there. And strict religious Puritan requirements alienated many New England colonists, and it spurred them to move west in pursuit of religious moderation and tolerance. So in the early 1630s, when the Mass Bay colony ran short of grain, of course, they were grossly unprepared for life in the New World. Very little of them knew how to farm, let alone how to farm in that area. And the Nipmuc Indians came from the Connecticut River Valley, and they loaded some of their abundant surplus maize or corn into birch bark backpacks. And of course, the three sisters were the corn, beans, and squash. Those were the three main vegetables that were grown in the New World that were native to Mesoamerica. And they took a familiar route to the settlements along the Charles River. And they traded for European goods like copper, iron, wool in exchange for their maize. Now, Watertown was organized by English Puritans in the year 1630. Okay, and it was first known to settlers as the Salt and Stall Plantation, one of the earliest of the Massachusetts Bay Colony settlements. And it was founded in 1630 by a group of settlers led by Richard Saltonstall and George Phillips. There's a monument today along the banks of the Charles in Watertown to commemorate Saltonstall. Now, if we look at their town seal of Watertown, you'll see at the bottom it says in pace condita, which means founded in peace. And it references the peaceful interchange of goods, the peaceful trade, a bass for a biscuit between Roger Clapp and Native Americans in the year 1630. And I always thought that would be a great name for a restaurant, the Bass and Biscuit in Watertown. But Clapp had explored the area of Watertown before the Puritans established the site after reaching it via the Charles River. So then that brings us to the Watertown Path. This is the trail that led from Boston to Watertown, where the settlers went, and it passed through modern-day Cambridge and was known as the Watertown Path. Today, Brattle Street lies upon the actual Watertown Path, which traveled all the way to Charlestown, and it was also called the Old Indian Trail. And this sign says way to Charlestown, Washington Street, Somerville, and Kirkland, and Brattle Streets, Cambridge, skirting marshes and river, follow the Old Indian Trail from Charlestown to Watertown. Along this way in 1636 went the Reverend Thomas Hooker and his congregation on their exodus from Cambridge to Hartford in Connecticut. So, fur traders and the original exploratory party of John Oldham in 1633 first penetrated the first of the trails west into the continent's interior. Now, you can see the pink line there. That's the historians, they call it the Spice or the Spice Old Connecticut Path. And then the Old Connecticut Path to Hartford and Wethersfield. And then there's another, Ayers is another historian who claims this is the route. So what I'm saying is there's the Old Connecticut Path, and then there's the Old Connecticut Path, which is genuine. Basically, two thoroughfares were named the same. So in 1635, some settlers from Watertown took this route when they removed to Wethersfield, Connecticut. And you can see that sign in Watertown today, settled under the Puritan leadership of Richard Saltonstall, Reverend George Phillips. stood firmly for religious tolerance and the right of the people to a representative government. And then this man, Thomas Hooker, 1636, a reverend, took his followers, New Englanders, and they moved into the lush Connecticut River Valley via the old Connecticut Path, and they spread out into other regions of New England and Connecticut. The soil was much better there, more temperate in terms of being in a valley, and that was a nice place for them to settle. And this sign says Thomas Hooker Trail. Crossing the highway at this point is the Indian Trail, followed by Thomas Hooker in 1636, when with his invalid wife, born on a litter, she had a baby, he led a company of Massachusetts settlers to found Hartford from Connecticut. So they followed the real old Connecticut Path that I call it, or the Great Trail, which meandered along the Pioneer Road, which they also called it, from Boston to Hartford. You can see roughly the Pioneer Road. It goes from Boston through South Framingham, Hopkinton, Upton, Manchog, Webster, Mass, Route 16, there are parts of that, into Westford, Tolland, Connecticut, et cetera, all the way to Hartford. And he had 100 of his outcast congregation, Hooker did, and with 160 cattle, whose milk they drank on the route, and of course they had the meat as well. They followed the old Connecticut Path on a 2 weeks journey to the Connecticut River Valley, where they settled in a place the native Lenape people called Suckiog because of the blackness of its earth. So if I said I was going to Suckiog, I meant I'm going to Hartford. And there they founded the English settlement of Hartford. And by 1643, documents in the village of Sudbury, Mass. Called this trail the Old Connecticut Path. So there you go. And William Pynchon, in 1635, he set out with 2 Indian scouts prospecting for beaver skins and fur, animal furs. And he was so impressed with what he saw in the Connecticut River Valley, he went back and asked the colony to be granted a permit to explore the western lands. And that brings us to the Bay Path. In the spring of 1636, Pynchon set out with his own family and other people of Roxbury to follow the Indian Trail and blaze a path through the wilderness to the desired lands along the Connecticut River, and he called this the Bay Path. And you can see it here. It meanders basically the Bay Path through Wayland, Sudbury, all the way to Marlborough, Westboro, Shrewsbury, Worcester, essentially modern-day Route 20. And originally, the Native American long path from the bay, from Boston Harbor, the bay, to the Hudson River was a distance of about 160 miles. And the Bay Path was first used by John Oldham in 1633 when he moved from Jamaica Pond to Springfield, Mass., a distance of about 92 miles. And it was long native usage had emphasized the easiest route to travel, skirt the water meadows of the river bottoms and cross streams at the most dependable fords or most shallow areas. And the path led west along the north bank of the Charles River from Newtown, which today is known as Cambridge, and to the newly settled Watertown, and it passed through what are now modern-day Waltham and Weston and Wayland. And then curved southward, where it entered the southeasterly section of the new town of Sudbury, which was now set apart as the town of Wayland, and where a section of the route still bears the name Old Connecticut Path. You can see it there. And there's the Bay Path in red, traveling from Boston as it meanders through different towns. It goes south here from Wayland all the way into Springfield. And at Wayland, the Bay Path later became the Boston Post Road and diverged from the Connecticut Path, which headed west through Marlborough, Worcester, and Brookfield, straight to the Connecticut River. And of course, the old route is still followed for part of its length by Massachusetts Route 9 and Massachusetts 126. And of course, here's a photograph of Route 126 in modern-day Wayland. Now in Sudbury, the Connecticut Path was known as the road from Watertown to the Dunster Farm, after it passed along the north side of Cochituate Pond. And the trail crossed the Sudbury River at an area they called Danforth's Farm. And in 1700, it was incorporated as the town of Framingham, which today is now a city. The Connecticut Path headed west, threading between the Charles and Sudbury rivers on its way to the Connecticut River. You can see it again. And there were all sorts of praying towns that the settlers attempted to brutally convert the indigenous people to Christianity and move them into praying towns, Indian praying towns. But anyways, a journal from 1769 says, from Framingham, the old Connecticut Path runs southward through South Framingham and Hopkinton, Grafton, and beyond, through Westboro, over to Wooded Glen, and then west to the bank of the Connecticut River opposite Hartford. Back to our map again. Essentially, that's the old Connecticut Path. You can see it in green there, and it runs just as it does along the same way as the old Connecticut Path, the Mass Turnpike, and a portion of the old Post Road, all the way down to Hartford. Now, the Pequot Path, or the Pequot Path. This was a Native American trail that traversed south and westward to the lands of the Pequot Indians. The earliest traveled highway used by the English settlers of Rhode Island connected Providence and westerly Rhode Island. First major war took place in 1637, called the Pequot War, in Connecticut. Conflict between the settlers, or the encroachers, maybe we can call them, on Pequot land, sacred land. Back to our map again, that's the Pequot Path, and portions of it are also known as the Old Roebuck Road, and also it connects into the King's Highway. Now, the Old Roebuck Road, this colonial route was one of the principal roads that came out of Boston. And at Providence, it connected with the Pequot Path to form a link in the chain of paths, which would go from Boston to New York. And a monthly post was established about the year 1690. And this would later be known as the Lower Post Road. In other words, roads that were used for delivering correspondences, packages, and families visiting each other. But you can see the Old Roebuck Road right there. And again, it's part of the King's Highway. It's also part of the Boston Post Road, the Lower Post Road, all the way down to Providence. And as if you want to travel through there, it's basically modern day Route 109, little part of Route 135. And you can see it here. Some of this travels, this is what we're going to call the Bay Road now. And you can see it going down from Dedham, modern day Route 1, essentially. So, Indian reaction to colonial encroachment in New England was fierce, but by 1676, King Philip's War, which began in 1675, horrific conflict and confrontation between Native American tribes and the settlers. Well, most Native resistance was eliminated, thereby opening the interior of New England to migrant farmers. Let's look at the Boston Post Road. If you look at this map, the top upper road is the red dotted line, the middle road is the dark blue dotted line, and the lower post road is the light blue line. So if you can see the modern thoroughfares, for all intent and purpose, the upper road, parts of Route 20, crosses the turnpike into Worcester, Route 9. And then we have the middle road, partially 140, but also travels on 109 to a certain extent. And then we have the lower road, which is modern day Route 1, parts of Route 95. So this Boston Post Road was created in 1673 as a crude riding trail and mail delivery routes that turned this into one of the first major highways in the United States. And a first post rider's journey, a round trip, would be a journey of over 250 miles. It would take 4 weeks. 2 weeks down to New York traveling, 2 weeks back, following the upper northern route, because the middle route was a bit shorter, but it had some more treacherous areas, and then the southern route was a bit longer. And again, the lower post road, which is now U.S. Route 1 along the shore via Providence, Rhode Island to Greenwich, Connecticut. That's the lower post road. And it was 270 miles long, and by the year 1800, you could take a 10-hour stagecoach ride from Boston to Providence. Now, a portion of the lower post road was originally part of the Pequot Path from Providence to New London, Connecticut. Back to our map, there you go. There's the Pequot Path. It runs along what's known as the King's Highway as well, and the lower post road. The middle post road diverged from upper road in Hartford and ran southwest from Boston. And this is the old Pioneer Road, or the old Great Trail that Hooker took, and it stretched for 225 miles. All the way down past Hartford. And then finally, the middle post road split off from the lower post road on old Route 1 in Dedham, and it progressed along modern day Route 16 and 109, proceeding along Route 44 to Mansfield, Connecticut. And the upper post road, which is now modern day U.S. Route 5 and U.S. Route 20, which went through Wayland, from New Haven, Connecticut, by way of Springfield, Mass. So right through Wayland, the upper post road. Now, all these three roads combined, and they went to New York City. The first stagecoach in service was put in use in the year 1772, and it made the trip in just 1 week, Boston to New York. Today, we do it in 4 hours in a car. And then the post roads were used for maneuvering soldiers and equipment, and it became important links between the states of the new nation as sections were improved. So once the United States, then the American Revolution began, vital to send messages and goods and armaments along these roads. Now here's the mile 8 marker of the Upper Post Road in modern Harvard Square. This was done in 1734. Now the Bay Road. Bay Road, you've probably actually driven on it. It's still part of it. It's still named the Bay Road. It's a route here, basically along Route 138, modern day Route 138. It's all of here. And it ran from Boston through Stoughton and Taunton to New Bedford, distance of about 60 miles. It was a toll road, and traffic declined after the introduction of the Taunton-Boston Railroad in 1835. In fact, the railroad was just invented in the 1820s originally, but in the 1830s it came to America, and by the 1840s and 1850s, before the Civil War, the railroad was all the rage. No need to take wagons when you could hop on the train. Now in 1805, Massachusetts legislature chartered a system of private roads or turnpikes, toll roads, designated to help facilitate travel and commerce. And they ran from Roxbury and all the way out and headed west. Tolls were collected along modern-day Route 9. Back to the map, there you go, the Mass Turnpike, I-90. Which, by the way, I-90, just so you know, begins at Logan Airport and ends just outside Safeco Field in Seattle, home of the Mariners. So, the King's Highway now. In 1664, King Charles II informed his governors in New York. New York was recently captured by the British from the Dutch. They renamed it New Amsterdam to New York. And New England, and he wanted to have communication between his two colonies in Plymouth, Boston, and New York. And that's why he wanted a King's Highway built. Again, he basically lengthened the roads that were already in place, including the Boston Post Road, which was a section of the King's Highway, and the King's Highway ran from Massachusetts to South Carolina. And essentially, it was a system of post roads containing some of the first major highways in the United States. Now, long before travelers reached New York City, they would pass farmers with wagon loads of produce, teamsters carting in water, young men taking their ladies out for a drive in one-horse chaises. And stagecoach service between Boston and Providence began actually in 1767. And if you look at the King's Highway, as you see, it stretches beginning in New Jersey through Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. And in various parts, it was called the Kennebunk Road. That's the part in Maine we'll talk about in just a moment. The Boston Post Road, the New York-Philadelphia Post Road, the Pequot Path, the Delaware Indian Path in New Jersey, the Great Coastal Road, the Potomac Trail, or the Great Savannah Trail. Now, the Kennebunk Road is a portion of the King's Highway that was carved into Maine along the coast. It ran from Kittery to Calais, and the first section was built in 1653 to connect the settlements of Kittery and York, Maine to Boston. And the road was soon extended to Portland, Maine, and the route was expanded and upgraded to a military road in 1761. And today, this historic road approximates U.S. Route 1 in Maine. And again, the King's Highway, you can see here on the map from Massachusetts all the way down to Charleston and actually into Savannah, Georgia. But it evolved from a network of Indian paths into postal trails and then into an important colonial American wagon stagecoach route for settlers along the Atlantic coast. But still, the sea route coming by sea and by boat was easier, safer, and actually faster. And as late as 1704, people found the lightly traveled postal road to be difficult. With rain, it would cause furrows and ditches and puddles and uneven gradient on the surface. Very difficult to ride. And can you imagine riding a stagecoach on that or in a wagon, how your back would hurt? But during the Revolutionary War, the King's Highway, which included the Boston Post Road, became the mustering point for several of the Revolutionary War battles, including the final battle at Yorktown. And a lady of courage by the name of Sarah Knight made the journey in 1704, and she recorded her impressions. She said that there was poor food at the inns, but that was the least of her problems, as fording the rivers was terrifying, crossing the rivers. And referring to the road as the King's Highway would come into disfavor with the colonists during the Revolutionary War. It's not the King's Highway, it's ours. So along many sections of this route today in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, the name Boston Post Road is still used. And the modern highway is Interstate 95, but parallel side roads still exist with the old name of Post Road. And of course, regular stagecoach travel could be accomplished between Boston and New York by the mid-1740s, but the journey was uncomfortable. Dust, rain, heat, snow. What a miserable experience. And a trip out of Boston would begin as early as 3 a.m. in the morning. You'd stay on the road for 17 hours, 60 miles. Then you'd get a short night at a ruddy inn. You'd have to spend it crowded, sleeping on the floor, maybe 2 or more people to a bed. The next day, more of the same. And then by 1750, a continuous road existed for stagecoach or wagon traffic from Boston all the way down to South Carolina in Charleston. Now, the first Concord stagecoach wasn't built until 1827 in New Hampshire, but it greatly improved the stagecoach experience. There's a Concord stagecoach. The Abbott Downing Company of Concord, New Hampshire employed leather strap braces under their stagecoaches, which gave a swinging motion instead of the jolting up and down of a spring suspension. And the citizens of the new nation sought increasing travel, and more better inns were constructed along the way for the tired and hungry travelers, like right here, the Colonial Inn in Concord. And as the stage driver approached a tavern, he would sound his horn to announce to the tavern keeper that hungry passengers were arriving, and they'd water his horses as well. And the food was quite good, according to John Adams on his trip to Philadelphia to the First Continental Congress, 1775. He's quoted as having enjoyed a meal of ducks, ham, chickens, beef, pig, tarts, creams, custard, jellies, trifles, beer, porter, punch, wine, etc. And for a portion of the stage journey over rocky roads, the carriage would be replaced by a crude wagon without springs, as a carriage with springs would have turned over and crashed and injured the passengers. And when there was traffic was known to be light in some areas, passengers would be transferred to a chariot drawn by only 2 horses, which was an economy factor. And Springfield, Mass. Was an important junction point. This is where the Traders Trail came in from Albany, New York, which was the colonial fur center of beaver trade at the time. And as I said, in 1772, by that time, stagecoach from New York to Boston was cut down to just 1 week. And finally, let's talk about the Mohawk Trail. It began as a Native American trade route connecting Atlantic tribes with tribes in upstate New York and beyond, following the Millers River, Deerfield River, and crossing the Hoosac Range in today's northwestern Massachusetts. It's also the route when settlers were returning to the east to Boston would come. They'd take the Iroquois Trail or the Mohawk Trail. And today it's part of routes 2 and 2A and follows the original Indian Trail from Athol, Mass. To Williamstown, Massachusetts for about 69 miles. Just in closing, we're not going to talk about it today, maybe in another presentation, but by the time that journalist John L. O'Sullivan wrote an article in 1845 declaring to the citizens of the United States that it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent, allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, construction of the first asphalt paved road in the United States had already begun. And it was also what I call a democide. It began the downfall of the indigenous tribes in America as the settlers encroached on their land and continued to push westward. Well, I want to thank you so much. I hope that you take the high road. Imagine a traveler from earlier centuries being around today with smart driverless automobiles, radio traffic reports, texting while driving, mall parking on Black Friday, or mobile videos, internet on demand, and of course the AAA. So we travel the same roads that our ancestors did in just a fraction of the time that they did. So think about that the next time you're riding home on these ancient interstates. Like when you're traveling on Route 128 North and Route 1 North, but at the same time, you're traveling on 93 South. You know where that is, right? Down towards Route 24. So anyways, I want to thank you so much for joining. My name is John Horrigan. Here are my sources. And on behalf of the WAYLAND Council on Aging, this has been Early American Roads and Highways, the Early American Roads and Highways of Massachusetts. Thanks so much for joining me. You take care now and be well. Until next time, thanks so much.